All right, so this will be the introduction to formation. I'm doing this on behalf of VM8 231. Um, I did want to thank you guys for making time to go through this today and hopefully get some value out of it. A little bit on why I'm the guy giving it. Uh, I'm a commercial instrument pilot. I've been flying for about 32 years off and on. I've got a little over 700 hours of flight time at this point. 200 of that is formation, and a fraction of that is also formation aerobatic. I've done about 300 hours in the last 3 years. It's all civilian flying. Um, I'm an engineer by trade. I've been in aerospace and defense for about 23 years. I've worked on the Joint Primary Aircraft Training System for the Air Force and the Navy. That's the T6A, B, and C that replaced the T-34 Charlies for the Navy and the T-37s for the Air Force. Also did some work on the Air Force's T-1A Jayhawk, which is the tanker transport training system. That's guys who don't take the fighter track will spend time in the T-1A, including Navy navigators. Will get training in that airplane. The team that I run right now is currently doing engineering support for a payload project for the FA-18G, the Growler, and also working on a range support aircraft for the Navy, which will be used at Point Magoo. Um, I'm a carded wingman in the Red Star Pilots Association, which is a signatory to the FAA's formation and safety team, so the FAST team, and should actually be getting my lead card through that organization sometime in the next few weeks. Um, I do lead a three-ship formation aerobatic team. I regularly participate in formation flyovers for sporting and social events. We do missing men flyovers for interments and things of that nature. Um, the RPA, the Red Star Pilots Association training that I go through or went through is a mix of Air Force and Navy training concepts. I know where most of the differences are, and so for CSG1, we'll basically focus on just the NATOPS items in particular. So moving on to slide two, it's kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about the contract, which is sort of the agreement that we have when we go into formation flying. Talk a little bit about terminology as it relates to stuff we'll be doing today. Very brief discussion on section and division, parade formation, parade being the focus for today, and section being the type that we'll fly today. We'll talk a little bit about the rendezvous or the rejoin because that was really the I think the origin of the discussion with Yomo. We'll talk a little bit about overrun. I'll try and provide some of the helpful hints or the good gouge, as we say, in terms of how to take the information and employ it. And then we'll wrap up with a quick discussion on references and documents. A couple of videos that were linked in there. We're not going to watch those today, but discuss those just a little bit. Um, I would add at this point, if you're on voice activated, please go to mic mute unless you need to ask a question. And we'll go ahead and move on to slide three. Okay, so slide three here, the contract. Formation flying is all about mutual support and mutual respect. And that respect is earned as a result of demonstrating competence. It's a case where the lead first they provides training, they identify that you're qualified, they make that determination, and then your wingmen get to fly with you and see that you're also competent. It's important because wingmen we must be able to trust each other to behave in a predictable, safe, and efficient way. Um, so the contract is basically to always remain focused on station keeping, providing mutual support to the wingman, and never intruding into another wingman's bubble. So the bubble basically is the airspace that surrounds an airplane. If you think of the dimensions of the plane, if you add about 3 feet to the nose, the tail, and the wingtips, and maybe 6 feet above and below, that's the bubble that defines the space that the other guy owns around his airplane. You don't want to intrude in there. So formation references, which we'll talk about in a second, they've been established to provide a minimum safe separation that will accommodate weather conditions, turbulence, minor distractions in the cockpit, and malfunctions all the way up through engine failure. And it does that by providing enough space around the aircraft, around that bubble, where the space equals time. And the time's important because you have to be able to see and react to what's going on. So that's why we talk about the contract. The contract's important to understand that the other guy owns a bubble around his airplane, and you're not to ever go into that bubble. Moving on to slide 4, couple of quick definitions. Section and division. Some of you guys, if you've spent time in the NATOPS, you're probably familiar with this, but section and division is how we identify portions of formation. So section is a two-ship. That's a lead and a wingman. A division is 3 or 4 aircraft. So you could have a section plus one, or you could have division, which is 2 sections. Air Force calls them an element. So a division would be 4 aircraft. In a division, you have the flight lead, then you have dash 2, which is his wingman. You have dash 3, who is the lead of the second section. 3 will also be the deputy lead for a flight, and typically you will organize a flight such that dash 3 should be capable to complete the mission if dash 1 goes down for any reason. If it's a mechanical loss of comms, or any other challenge. So I mentioned references before. The next 3 items here are the references. That's the bearing line, the step down, and lateral distance or offset. So those are all used to define your position relative to the airplane you're flying formation off of. So all formation flight is basically about getting into and maintaining those references. Related to the bearing line in particular, I didn't put them on this slide initially. I will add them to an update. There are 2 terms that we will use. They are acute and sucked. Acute means you are forward of the bearing line where you want to be. Acute is the danger zone because it limits lead's ability to maneuver. If lead has to make a maneuver and you are acute, you're actually in the danger zone there. You're potentially going to create an issue for lead. If you are aft of the bearing line, we call that sucked. So the easiest way to think about it is if you're sucked, you're going to have to add power. If you're acute, you need to reduce power. In parade and cruise, those are the only 2 types of what's called administrative formation, which is non-tactical. Parade is just like it sounds. It's when you want to look good. It's the money shot. It's the Blue Angels diamond. Cruise is used when you want to remain in visual contact. You're not extending out to where yardstick is important in order to maintain situational awareness. The rendezvous, again, is the primary focus for this evolution will be the rendezvous and the overrun. So they'll get a little bit more focus on their own. Basically, any other formation you're likely to experience in DCS is tactical formation or TAC form. And we can address that in separate items. I know a lot of the guys that are focused on the more standards-based flying should be spending a lot of time on that. TAC form does not have the same collision hazards that we have in parade, and that's why we're going to spend a little bit more time on the rendezvous and the overrun here. Last item for this slide that's not on there is we'll talk just from a communication standpoint. In formation, we try to be very directive and then also very brief. We'll use the brevity code. So typically, if lead gives a command, really we only want to hear the dash number reply with their flight number. So it would be to go echelon, and I would just expect 2 to say 2 and nothing else as an example. So moving on to slide 5, nice pretty picture here of a section. Section again is a two-ship formation. The picture is providing us with two of the three elements for being in position, two of the references. So the bearing line is you should be looking down the flap line, flap aileron line on the top of the wing. That sets your fore aft spacing. The offset, the lateral offset in and out, basically left or right, is set by placing the pogo wheel basically into, there's an avionics panel on either side of the fuselage, and that's what the second image on the right hand side says. Step down, which is the vertical separation, is set by placing the wingtip level with the bottom of the fuselage. So it's actually a very simple picture, and your scan, if you will, should be predominantly focused on bearing line. Second is the lateral offset, and third is the step down. And so basically, it's just like an instrument scan. You're going to be moving between those three over and over again.
Can you repeat that?
As far as the way to do the scan,
Yes.
yeah. So from a scan standpoint, you focus on the bearing line first. Second is the offset. So that's the moving yourself off to the side the correct distance. And then the third is the step down. And so you'll basically scan between those three over and over and over again. The most important of them is the bearing line. The second most important is the offset. The reason for that is you're trying to avoid wingtip overlap in particular, and then secondly, nose to tail overlap, which in the Harrier and in fact in most fast jets, you have nose to tail overlap because you have to be in a position on these larger aircraft where you can actually see lead and lead can see you. Um, that's for a couple of reasons. One thing we don't do in DCS obviously is we can't do hand signals. In real world formation flying, I should be able to conduct a flight from once we depart the takeoff field. I should be able to conduct the entire flight without ever saying a word on the radio. I can do everything I need to do with hand signals and or with aircraft signals. And I think we'll talk a little bit about aircraft signals on one of the next slides, but we won't use that today. I'll be directive. So moving on to slide 6, which is the really the primary focus for today, which is the rendezvous or the rejoin. The rendezvous is it exists for the sole purpose of being able to efficiently assemble or reassemble a flight, and that's whether it's a two-ship section, a four-ship division, or even more. There are two types of rendezvous. There is the straight ahead or running rejoin. That's the upper image. The other one is a turning or circling rejoin. So the turning or circling rejoin is what we'll start with because it's actually easier, which you'll understand in a minute. But in both cases, lateral offset being well to one side or the other of the aircraft you're joining on is very important, and it's not just for safety. If you have a lot of overtake and you're coming straight up behind somebody on their six, you actually have a collision hazard. The other benefit from being offset to the side is it gives you a much better visual ability to gauge distance and closure rate. Uh, when you're in closer extended trail, when you're on the six, it's very difficult to gauge closure. And because of the types of closure rates that we can generate in these airplanes, I've accidentally come up on the tanker with about 80 to 90 knots of closure, and there's literally no way to fix that. You can't fix it. And so that leads us then to the next discussion, which is slide 7, which is the overrun. Um, Anytime you're attempting a rendezvous and you perceive or you're told by lead that you have too much closure. The overtake is too great, or uh, so overtake is the fore aft motion, right? That's speed. Closure is also based on the lateral offset and your step down, whether you're stacked up, stacked down. So in any case where one of those three looks unrecoverable before you're going to be in a collision hazard with the aircraft you're joining on, it is up to you as the wingman to initiate an overrun. So the NATOPS manual is very clear. There's like four steps to the overrun. First is lower the nose. That provides vertical separation. Second is throttle idle if it's not already there. Third is boards. Put the speed brake out. And then the fourth is to turn towards the outside of the lead or the aircraft you're joining on. So if it's a circling rejoin and lead is in a left-hand turn, you're going to be joining from the inside, from the left. If you have excessive closure, excessive overtake, or you just don't feel comfortable with how the rejoin is going, and you're concerned there's a collision hazard, always initiate an overrun, and you just call it. Going under is an adequate call. Overrun is actually the proper call. So the objective here is you want to pass safely below and preferably behind the aircraft you're joining on. Obviously, if there's other aircraft in the formation, you have to avoid them as well. So stay low, and you're actually going to turn. It's counterintuitive. We talked about this in the Discord a little bit. You're turning towards the collision hazard. So it doesn't feel right at a gut level, but it's actually what you need to do. The reason is that um, turning away from the aircraft you're afraid you're going to hit uh, closes the turn circle, forces you to go acute, and will drive you to be blind. Turning towards the aircraft you're concerned about running into opens your turn signal. So from a turn circle, so from a geometry standpoint, it actually starts to reduce your energy benefit, the thing that's causing the overtake or the excessive closure. And so the whole purpose there is to open your turn circle, which reduces or removes the overtake or the acuteness. You want to avoid a hard bank to stop that at the end of the overrun. So don't think that because now you're past lead, everything's cool and you can do a 90-degree Susie chapstick stop. If you do that, the problem is that typically will result in an increase in altitude because you're pulling G's to make that stop. And what happens when you roll wings level, you'll be climbing and you'll go blind on lead again and potentially be creating another collision hazard. So just let the airplane run out, stay low, keep lead in sight. If you go acute during that portion, just stay in the condition you're in, throttle idle, boards out, match lead's bank once you're not getting further acute, and then very quickly you will find that the geometry of the situation has put you to where you're no longer acute and you're going to go sucked really pretty quickly. At that point, lead will clear the overrun aircraft to move back into position, come back to the inside, and to attempt the rendezvous again. The key here, the most important thing, is that the gut instinct to roll away from lead is wrong and dangerous. You're going to go belly up. That makes lead nervous because he knows you can no longer see him, and if he has anybody else flying formation with him, if anyone else was already, for example, rejoined and is established, his ability to maneuver the flight now out of that collision hazard is very limited. Again, it forces you to go acute. It's geometry. It's physics. By tightening your turn signal circle rather, you're moving forward, which is not what you want, and you're going blind, which you also don't want. So again, never, never, never go belly up on lead or the aircraft you're joining on. You really want to be sort of spring loaded or hair trigger, particularly at the beginning, to throw a bad rendezvous away and call the overrun. All right, so moving on to slide 8, Good Gouge. This, I think, is the one Yomo even commented on this in the discussion in the Discord, that the helpful hints like this are what actually gets to be really, really helpful. So first is smooth and controlled input. related, and minimal speed variation is the other thing. You want to control your overtake. You don't want to have more than about 25 knots of closure initially. Um, Thinking about smooth controlled inputs and speed, that brings up a couple of points that are better spoken to than trying to type them up. You need to think of every power change in formation as having three parts. There's an initial adjustment that's to correct whatever situation you've identified. If you're acute, you're going to remove power. If you're sucked, you're adding power. So after that initial adjustment, the next step is an intermediate and opposite input, and that's to arrest whatever change you did. For example, if you've added power, you want to take some but not all of the power that you just put in back out once you see that you're moving in the direction you intended. Then the third step is to then fine tune that power, pitch, roll, or rudder, whatever the input is, to maintain reference. Um, the key to good formation flying is all about anticipation, uh, mostly with power. So you need to know, for example, that if you're going to climb or you're pulling up, you have to put power in. If you're reducing power or diving, you need to pull power. I'm sorry. If you're diving or pushing the nose down for some other reason, you need to pull power out. If you're in the wingman position, if lead turns into you, you're going to need to reduce power. If you're in a wingman position and lead turns away from you, you're going to need to add power. So keep all of that in mind and be as anticipatory as you can. Power changes are the thing that causes probably almost half of the challenge that you're going to have in flying a good formation, and it's because it's directly related to being acute or being sucked, and then it will impact your ability to maintain references once lead is maneuvering. So as soon as you perceive that, hey, lead's turning into me, pull a little power. Lead's turning away, add some power. So it's all about anticipation. Um, I mentioned a little bit on overtake. One thing that's important, particularly with parade flying, is the closer you are, so the more accurate you are for flying reference, the easier it is. And this is true in the real world. It's actually, I've checked it, it's true in DCS as well. The closer you are, it's easier for you to perceive changes in the aircraft you're flying off of. So you're able to see, I'm moving acute. I need to pull a little bit of power. If you wait, because, or if you can't perceive it because you're further away and it takes longer for you to notice, the corrections get bigger. And when the corrections get bigger, it's just like pilot-induced oscillation on the ground. When you're close to the ground, if you've misjudged the flare for a landing and now you're chasing it, I'm trying to figure out if I can touch down or not. The whole thing about making it easy on yourself to fly is to make minor, small, smooth inputs. The other thing, very important in formation flying, is the use of trim. You absolutely want to use trim. Trim is your friend. Typically, in the real world, I will trim slightly nose down when I'm flying wing. That's because I want to hold a little bit of pressure. I don't know that that's as good a concept in DCS because we don't have force feedback, unless you're flying force feedback, in which case maybe it makes sense. I would try and trim to neutral, I think, in DCS. I haven't spent enough time trying to fly wing, though, to get a feel for that. The turns on IFR and VFR, we're not going to play with that today, so we'll skip those for now. I mentioned always be willing to throw away a bad rendezvous and call the overrun. It's the safest thing to always do. Specific to the circling rejoin, which is the first thing we'll play with today, the picture is really helpful here. Um, you know, I would assume that everybody's kind of familiar with the concept of lead pursuit, pure pursuit, and lag pursuit. So the three pictures actually indicate in a related but not direct way the result from each of those three types of pursuit. So if you're thinking about trying to put your weapons onto another aircraft, There are three types of pursuit that you'll fly. Lead pursuit, you're actually putting your vector in front of the guy you're trying to catch up to. So in pure pursuit, you're actually are you're trying to kind of put your vector on the aircraft, and then in lag pursuit, you're putting your vector behind the aircraft. Now, why would you do that? So you do it because you're trying to either add or reduce distance between the aircraft. That's ultimately what it boils down to. In the circling rejoin, which is what that picture on slide 8 is for, the left side, the one that says high aspect, that's what happens when you've pulled a lot of lead pursuit. You've actually gotten very acute, and so from an angular standpoint, you're in. It'd be very easy for you to roll in and take a shot on the guy. However, for the rejoin, it's created a situation where you're going to have a lot of excess energy. Um, the second picture, the moderate aspect picture, where the vertical stab is basically over the outer wingtip, that's the bearing line. That's where you want to be. That's also effectively pure pursuit in terms of the geometry of the rejoin. If you're sucked, if you're behind, the distance is opening, and that's what the low aspect is, where the vertical tail is actually forward of the wingtip. And in that case, you're losing ground, and your turn circle is not optimal for getting into position for the rejoin. So when you're conducting a rejoin, the easiest way to visually tell whether you are acute on the bearing line or sucked is that picture right there. Acute, there's visual space between the wingtip and the vertical. And I tried this flying with Red the other day, just to give me some wing time in the Harrier. And these references, although they're a little bit different because of the slightly swept wing and the shape of the tail of the Harrier, it will actually work. So if there's visual space between the outer wingtip and the vertical, you're acute. You're forward to where you want to be. So the correct action is to take a turn towards lead. When the vertical is basically overlapping the outer wingtip, geometrically you're where you want to be. You kind of use power and little nibbles in and out, away and towards lead, to continue working up the bearing line to get to where you're in position. The low aspect, where you're sucked, you actually need to turn away from lead, and it's counterintuitive because when you look at the situation, it's like, God, he's getting further and further away. I should turn towards his flight path. That's going to just make it worse. It makes it more sucked. So again, if you're acute, you turn away from lead. If you're sucked, you turn towards lead. And so that's really the thing you want to get out of those pictures there. Um, with respect to overtake, you can use speed and power to fix a lot of issues. And in tactical aircraft, since we're going to be flying probably 300 knots indicated, you can generate a substantial amount of overtake. A Harrier at wide open, and we'll be doing this at 5,000 feet. You can do 600 knots, I think, clean or damn close to it. So you can get a lot of overtake. You want to manage your overtake. So part of that's on lead. I will call out speeds and altitudes to minimize the challenge in terms of setting an overtake speed. So what I've found flying with Red, flying against AI, is that at the speeds we'll be operating at, going throttle idle and boards out will correct up to about 20 to 25 knots of difference. More than that, you're probably going to force an overrun whether you meant to or not. As you get closer, and by that I would say when you think you're maybe five wingspans out and maybe one or two plane lengths behind, um, you should reduce that overtake to more 10 to 15 knots. Once you're good at this, and you can actually do a circling rendezvous from extended trail, fixed throttle in a circling rendezvous. You will not need to change your power at all, and you can do it all with geometry. And I will tell you, when you get to that point, it's very rewarding because you're like, holy cow, I actually did that purely with airmanship and no power at all. Um, so one thing to keep in mind as it relates to all formation flying, but parade in particular, because we'll be closer. I should tell you to take spacing before we do anything like a configuration change, fence in or out, which we're not going to do today. If we're making radio frequency changes, anything that requires control inputs that are not on your HOTAS, or anything that requires heads down time, you should take spacing. That spacing, um, because of the rates that we're capable of generating, closure rates, laterally and in terms of overtake fore and aft, because these aircraft can be so energetic, that spacing is going to be probably on the order of probably at least 4 or 5 wingspans, um, at a bare minimum would be my recommendation. Um, Typically, in cruise or when you've been wagged out, and we'll talk about that in another time, but if you've gone out to take spacing, you want to be between, on the right hand side, you want to be between the 3 and 5 o'clock positions. On the left hand side, you want to be between the kind of the 9 and 7 o'clock positions. Um, in the real world, I have a tendency to move forward when we're taking spacing. The reason for that is if you're adding the lateral separation and you get sucked behind the bearing line, it's a greater effort to get back into position. So you're giving yourself a minor position advantage by being slightly forward. So move towards, I would say, the 8 or 9 o'clock position on the left hand side, and the 4 or 3 o'clock position on the right. That'll just make the eventual coming back into parade will make that a lot easier. So last slide, references and documents. These are just places to go to get more information about this stuff. So obviously the flight manual for the Harrier, section 9, which is the special section. The first part of that is all about formation. There's a little bit about parade, and then a whole bunch about um, what do you call it? TAC form. Um, then the Red Star Pilots Association, I put a link on that in somewhere in Discord previously. Page 30 is where the reference that we were just looking at comes from, which again is probably the most important element of understanding what to do when in the rejoin in particular. Also, the master syllabus, the master FSG for the Harrier. There's a series of formation sortie cards. Starts with I think it's 1300. Those are all actually very good cards to review. Today there's no scoring standard. I'm not going to hold anybody to standards because it's our first time playing with it. Um, Videos. The first video is from a T6B, a Navy T6B. Guys doing a rejoin ultimately to the outside, and it provides a really good overview of the sight picture during the rejoin. The second video is one of mine, and it's a join straight to the outside, which is a slight difference between the NATOP standard. You'll notice on the first video the T6 comes up on lead, he pauses for a moment, and then he makes a deliberate cross under and moves to the outside. Our standards in the RPA, if we're joining to the outside, we just go straight. There is no pause. Once the guy that is on the inside is stable, we go right underneath he and lead straight to the outside position. So there's a little difference there. In future discussions, if we want, we can look at cross unders, we can look at echelon, we can look at extended and close trail, VFR and IFR turns, which are flown a little bit differently depending on which wing position you're in. And then TAC form is a completely different animal altogether. I would suspect that most guys who've been in DCS for a while should be pretty comfortable with TAC form, but we won't be doing any of that today. So that's kind of the overview that I wanted to provide.